Good Saturday morning, everybody. This is Chuck Schultz with Michigan Sawmill Sales and Patriot Builders PFC. This is the first video in the series of Anatomy of a Michigan Pole Barn Home. Thanks for joining me on the first day of fall 2023, and we're going to talk about foundations of a Michigan pole barn home. There are many different types of foundations you can do for a post frame. You can just sink posts into the ground on a footing pad, whether it's 6x6 treated post or 3-ply laminated columns, or you can even do like a sturdy wall where it's got a concrete base set in the ground with a bracket and you go up from there. But we prefer if it's a post on a pier or a trench footing. So you've got posts that sink into the ground is one way. You can pour a solid mass concrete pier of whatever diameter foundation you determine is what is needed. There's a formula in to determine that, which is taking the weight of the building, finding out how much weight is going on average per column, and then you divide that weight per column by the amount of soil bearing capacity, and then that determines your footing size. And it's a whole nother issue, but there's a way to determine what actual diameter footing you need if you're doing either post into the ground onto a pad, or if you're filling that whole pier up, the whole post hole. So you're creating a pier footing out of concrete and then setting your columns on top of that with a bracket, whether it's a wet set or a bolt-on application. We preferred it either at the minimum to do a solid concrete pier up to 6 inches below the finished floor. And the reason we go 6 inches below the finished floor is because we have 2 inches of rigid foam and 4 inches of floor. So we pour that footing to 6 inches below the finished floor height. And then we also want to know what our floor height is to the surrounding grade. So we determine that in the grading process. So that way we determine our height of our foundation. My preferred method is doing a trench foundation. I'll get into that in a little bit. And then there's another method that is a little bit better than the trench foundation, which is a stem wall, which you would then excavate in the perimeter a little bit wider than obviously doing a trench footing, and then you would lay down a spread footing and then stack about an 8-inch stem wall on top of that, coming up to your desired height. So that is probably the most expensive way, but it probably is the most bulletproof. But I go on value. Value has your cost of output and then your functional gain per cost. You can look at it many different ways, but I think that if I'm spending $1 and I'm getting X, and you divide, there's basically for how many dollars I'm spending, what functional gain am I receiving out of it? What kind of value am I receiving out of it? And that determines the value to me. It's not about the cheapest price. Anything that's cheap is usually not good. So, but finding a good value for a certain cost, that's what we're after. So going back to pouring pier columns, is probably the cheapest way if your municipality isn't going to make you, or the designer isn't drawing it into the plans to where you need rat walls, concrete rat wall under the slab between your columns, because that does nothing to anchor anything down. It's just to prevent any heaving on your floor. So as that grade freezes, it could potentially cause a frost heave. So they typically want a solid mass surface where your floor is going on top of it that is frost protected, whether it's a shallow wall frost-free trench or if it's going all the way down to the frost line. In our area, it's 42 inches. So once you start doing that, I think the pier column approach ends up being cost prohibitive. You end up doubling up on labor because then you're coming through and drilling columns, filling that up, and then you got to go back at some point and trench out in between those columns and fill them with concrete. If I got to go that route, I would just go right straight to a 12-inch wide, 40, in our case, 42-inch deep footing. You gain much more soil bearing capacity. Well, a bearing of the footing, but you're getting more surface area to the soils. So even if you have a little bit poor quality soil bearing capacity, you're going to get a much better stable foundation. It adds a ton more ballast weight for the structure because we're attaching these, and I'll get into that in a minute. I'm going to use an example of a house with about a footprint of 2160. So it's about a 30 by 72 foot footprint of a house, in example. And I'm going to show you all the different pros and cons of determining from having to really shave pennies and go with a pier footing or going to a trench foundation or something even more. In some cases, if we are in a real sugar sandy soil, real loose soil type that still has good soil bearing capacity, but the soils won't hold together, the trench foundation isn't a good idea because all it's going to do is collapse in on itself, and you're going to end up with a real wide mass of a hole to fill up with concrete, or you'll have to do all kinds of other forming, and it is a major pain in the butt. So that would push us into doing a stem wall foundation. So typically in those situations, we would divert to a stem wall foundation. But anytime you got good sturdy soils where they will still hold with excavation, so we can do use a 12-inch bucket, you're going to end up with a 14-inch wide trench when we do that. But as long as those soils are strong enough to hold, we're going to do the trench foundation with a hoe and trench out that foundation, and then use the earth as the form of the concrete. And then that gets us to our most cost-effective, highest strength as far as stability for the building. You get 6 times more ballast weight for the structure, and I'll get into why that matters, because the way we anchor the columns to a pier footing or a trench foundation, or if we had a stem wall situation in our area, in most builds, they're not going to really require us to do a wet set bracket. So we're going to do a bolt-on bracket to the top of that foundation. And I'll get into the calculations and the math in a little bit here of why that trench footing adds a lot more value than to go with pier footings. And I'm going to pick on those two mostly because that's one or the other what we do in most cases. So I'm going to flip the camera around and kind of show on a piece of paper. I apologize, I don't have a whole bunch of technology here, but I'm going to show you a print that is about ready to be put under construction, and it's how it's drawn with a trench foundation. So I'm going to come in here. These prints were just approved the other day. So right here we're showing a 12-inch wide footing, a perimeter foundation. And a lot of times this might be what separates why you may be able to or not be able to do a post frame home, because this is under the definition a continuous perimeter foundation, and that's where the big loopholes are at the cities and zoning for knocking out the barndominium. Right down here, this is a house we built, and again, this is a smaller printout. I'm going to kind of zoom in a little bit here, but it's pointing out that in this plan right here, we have individual 16-inch diameter, 42-inch deep post or pier footings under each column, and we put a sturdy wall bracket on top of that, and then stand our columns up in those brackets, and they're very, very strong. So we have built this particular house with this footing diameter, footing layout in Livingston County, and then it wasn't 4 months later we were doing a very similar home of the same size, same pretty much exterior footing layout, and they wanted us to do a frost-free rat wall. And that was because they were afraid the floor would heave. And even though in here, in our code book, right here, this code right here in the code book, and you guys probably can't read it, but it's the code R403.1, and it's also got a detail in here of a frost-free slab. And in this house right here with the pier footings, we were able to do that. But in the next one, 4 months later, they required us to put a rat wall between every column. So then we were into a whole nother expense game. We had to come in and drill holes, pour those column footings or pier footings, and then go back and trench in and fill those in. And we didn't double the cost of concrete, but we definitely increased the cost of concrete. So basically we diverted into doing this layout and that other build as a trench foundation like this one here. And that is actually a better foundation. This particular home was built with the intention of being to code and for a very tight budget. But the difference of doing this home with a pier footing foundation and this is just without the rat walls that they were requiring, with just the piers, was a little under half the cost of doing a trench, with a lot less functional gain out of it. So I'm going to go over here. Here's a little bit of the math that I did, and this is comparing a pier footing to a trench footing. So pier footing being like this, a trench footing appearing like this on the plans with the post locations. The pier footing had a soil bearing square footage of 32 square feet on this house. The same house as a trench footing would have 204 square foot of contact for the footings to bear on the soil, leaving us with 6 times. So the trench footing wins out here. It's 6 times better value of soil bearing capacity. The next one was the ballast weight. So we need to break away on something. So the ballast, so it's the weight of all the piers added together was about 18,000 pounds. For a trench footing, it was about 107,600 pounds, making the trench footing in this category 6 times better than the pier footing because it had 6 times the ballast weight. The cost of the pier footings were about $3,150. The cost of the trench footing is about $8,570. Now in this case, the pier footing wins out because it's 2.7 times cheaper than the trench foundation. So going over here, and this is kind of a crude way for me to balance out the cost to value ratio. So you have a trench footing. Its wins had 6 times better for a total value of 12 in just these 3 categories. In the cost category, the pier footings make it out by 2.7 times better. So I took the 2.7 times, minus that, I get a 9.3 times better for the trench. So that's out of cost, weight capacity that trench footing can hold, and the ballast weight for when these buildings rack. That is what's holding this thing to the ground. Okay, now here's another one I didn't put in there, was this particular house has 24 columns in it. Now, each bracket has a break force, a failure force of 5,900 pounds to make that bracket fail. Times 24 columns, you've got a total failure force load of 141,600 pounds. Now, if we're using that kind of anchoring to a foundation, you would want something that comes as close to that number as possible, right? Because now the wood and the foundation is the weakest link, right? That bracket is not the weakest link. So in a pier foundation in this house, going back to our ballast weight, we've got 18,000 pounds of concrete acting as ballast weight for this house as it is undergoing forces of nature, call it wind. The trench foundation is providing a value of 107,600 pounds. So it's a lot closer to this 141,000 pound of failure force right here. Now, if we have to depend on that failure force in Michigan with Michigan's construction practices, we got bigger problems. So as of right now, I would say I prefer, hands down, between a pier foundation and a trench foundation in this situation. The trench foundation is a much better value, even though it's a little over double the cost of a pier footing. But once we end up with some municipalities making us do these frost-free rat walls so that they're afraid there might be any upheaving in the freeze-thaw cycle for the slabs, this cost right here could go up another $1,500, $2,000, if not even a little bit more, bringing it closer to the cost of the trench footing, which solves all the problems that they're worried about. And then again, let's not forget the stem wall system. The stem wall system, I think, will be about, I didn't do a mathematic equation on what it would cost on this particular build of that foundation, a 30 by 72 foundation. But I would say a stem wall foundation would be about 2 times the cost of the trench footing. So going between the value between a trench footing and a stem wall footing, I don't think for the dollars spending to get the stem wall, the functional gain, I don't think we're getting more than double the bearing capacity and the ballast weight or anchoring to the ground as an increase in value. So I would say I would go here if I had to, but I would default always to the trench foundation. And so that kind of puts that in perspective. I hope this video helps everybody looking to do a post frame. And we have many more to do, and I know I went way over the 5-10 minute. So if you made it this far, I appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel, please subscribe. There's many more short videos I'm going to try to do. I know this one got we're approaching the 20-minute mark right now, but we're going to touch on a lot of different facets, going to wall sections, insulation, a lot of different processes in here, and I'm going to definitely try to do one video a week. So thanks for sticking with me on this. There's so much to talk about. I could probably do a 4-hour class, if not longer, on what makes our Michigan pole barn homes stand out in performance value for energy, structural ability, comparative to the different style of construction, which is platform framing, what we've been doing for the last 95 years. So again, thanks for everybody for tuning in. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll have more of these coming on different parts and details of our post frames. Chuck Schultz, Michigan Sawmill Sales is my other company and the channel name, but Patriot Builders PFC, where we, that's the home of the Michigan Pole Barn Homes. So thanks again. Have a great day.